Alright, hello everybody and welcome to my review of Photoshop. I'm sure we went over a little bit of what's going on in class, so I just kind of want to give you a better rundown of more of the windows and kind of what's going on in Photoshop. By the end of this, I'll give you a tutorial that you can go through to kind of give you some more hands-on experience, because watching me do a bunch of stuff isn't going to help you as much as actually doing it yourself. But I just wanted to talk about some of the stuff that's in here, because looking at this, I'm sure it's pretty overwhelming. So this panel right here is the Learn Photoshop. It has a bunch of projects, tips, all this stuff that they've built in that you can go through and look at and kind of get a feel from their side. There's also this libraries panel here, and this is basically just a cloud folder that you can make and build different directories in the Creative Cloud so that you can go back through and use them in different projects. We won't be using that for this class, so unless you want to go through all of these Learn Photoshop and whatnot, we're going to click this little button right up here to collapse both of these so that we don't have to look at them for now. And then right next to that, you can see we have colors, swatches, gradients, patterns. All of this stuff is just little libraries that are included for colors and whatnot. But we're going to focus on this one for now. It's what I use the most often. So this is probably a little bit confusing to look at right out of the bat. But this is just your standard RGB color picker. So this bar right here is your hues. And then this kind of determines where you are between hues, saturation, and the luminance or brightness of the color. So that's going to be determined by this. So that maps black to white. This corner right here is full saturation, full hue. So this whole side is that high saturation color to low saturation color, and then the top part is high brightness and the bottom low brightness. So I'm sure that doesn't make a lot of sense right now. That is something we will go over at a later day. I just wanted to let you know what that does. So if you don't understand it, don't even worry about it. This is just where we can pick colors. And that's all you really need to know for now. We're going to stick with black just for now, so we can get used to just drawing in Photoshop. A fun thing, by the way, if you have a couple of weird colors, you can go over to here and just select your default black and white. And then this little arrow right here lets you swap between them. Shortcut that lets you do that is the X key. So that's super helpful if you're drawing things that need two different colors and you have them both on your palette at the same time. And then right underneath this, we have the properties, which is just a bunch of, right now it's just telling us the width of our canvas, which is a 1500 by 1500 pixel canvas, and a bunch of other little things. I wouldn't worry too much about this panel, because it's just going to give you a bunch of technical information that you can go in and edit to change where things are. So don't worry about that too much. The adjustments layer, we will get back to these, but these are fun little things you can add to change things like color, and just add a bunch of different effects to your layers. Speaking of which, next we have the layers panel, and this is the most crucial part of Photoshop. So we have our background layer, which right now is just a white blank canvas, and as you can see, it's locked. So if we want to do anything fun with this, we have to add a new layer, which you can do by clicking this button right here. And now we can draw on this layer without affecting anything on the layer below it. And then we can always add things and draw beneath this layer. So these layers come with different effects. So this is the blending style right here. And as you can see, all of these do slightly different things with how those two layers overlay over each other. I know that's a lot of weird stuff, but say this one overlay, for instance. As you can see, it kind of appears in the red stroke. And then another one, let's say hue, you can see it makes it gray where it overlaps. All of these are really weird, and honestly, I don't understand them on a technical level, but the best way to kind of acquaint yourself with those, if you're interested, is to go through and just play with them. You can honestly find some really interesting effects while you're drawing. Say, like your shadows, you can set to multiply, or your highlights to overlay. Just kind of get some interesting effects. And then we have a bunch of other stuff here too. Okay, let's make a new one. Let's just delete these two layers. You can select them. You can select multiple by holding shift. And then if you want to delete them, you can just hit this little trash can. It's going to ask you, just say yes. Another interesting thing you can do with layers. So let's say we have this red circle here, right? So these locks are going to change how the layer like interacts, right? So this right here is a transparency lock, which means now if I draw on it, you can see it only affects where that layer already is. So if I'm like shading or something, I'm not going to be overlapping. And then this one is a brush lock layer, so you can't draw on it. It won't let you. This one doesn't allow you to move it. This one right here. So if we hit the move thing, it's not going to move it. Okay, so this one is a weird thing that only works with artboards, which is something we're not going to be worrying about. That's more involved in other programs like Illustrator and importing from there. And then this just applies all of those locks, so you can't interact with the layer at all. Okay, so that's the layer panel, so you won't even let me delete it. So let's now look at all of our tools. So this is the move tool that lets you move something around. Here, let's just make another layer so we have something to interact with. And the nice thing about Photoshop is that it will tell you what each one of these tools does if you hover over it. So like this is the move tool. As you can see, it kind of lets you move things around. And then you have these different selection tools. You have the marquee, which just lets you do a box, the lasso, which lets you kind of freehand draw a selection, and then the magic wand, which lets you just select everything it deems as a group. So, like say it's going to select all the red, or it's going to select all of the white. This is the crop tool. It lets you crop a photo down into something smaller. And also, an interesting thing to note here is it's taking, as you can see this color here that's not white, it's taking the background color that we have on our palette. So we're just going to cancel that. This one is your eyedropper tool. It lets you select colors. A great way to get to that is if you're in the brush tool to hold Alt. This is the spot healing tool. This is more of a photo manipulation tool, but basically you can just, if we have a lighter cyan, okay. Say we have this dot here and we don't like how that looks and it's like a photograph and we don't want to paint over it, we can just use this spot healing tool and it will automatically delete that and make it match with the object around it. Some of these we won't have to worry about, but again, you can hover over them or go through the Photoshop Learn tutorial to kind of figure out what some of these do. This is the eraser tool. If you're using a tablet that has an eraser on the back of your pen, like mine does, you can just turn it around and use that to erase. And then when you turn it back, it'll be your brush. So if I'm stuck on the brush tool here, see I can draw, I'll turn my pen around and erase, but I'm still in the brush. So that's super useful. This is the paint bucket tool. If you've ever used paint, then you know how this works. So if we just, let's get blue, how about? If we just draw something like that, we can just fill it right in. It's not perfect, but as you can see, if you just kind of click anywhere else, it'll fill in. So that can be super useful if you want to color quickly. Then we have the smudge tool, which I'll show you. It just smudges things around, kind of blends it together. I've got a special blender on. Yours isn't going to do quite like that, but you get the idea, you know, it kind of blends things together. This is the dodge tool, and what the dodge tool does is it just lightens your colors. So it works kind of like some of the blending modes do, but it's a little weird. There's also the burn, which does the opposite. It darkens your colors. So that's something you can play around with. The pen tool is a little bit complicated. We're not going to get into it right now. That's something you would learn more about if you ever used, say, Adobe Illustrator. The text tool lets you type things. I mean, kind of obviously, but you know, it's an option. You know, super easy. And then it appears as a separate layer in your layers panel that you can mess around with. We're going to get rid of it though. We don't need it. Polygon tool, sort of like the pen tool. It makes, you know, you can make rectangles and whatnot with it. And then here's the property panel coming in clutch. So you can choose colors for your rectangle to be. So, you know, all useful stuff. Okay, so now that we're kind of more acquainted with how Photoshop looks and handles, and hopefully it's a little less intimidating to look at now that you kind of have an idea of what's going on. And if I'm going over too much right now, feel free to ask me kind of if you have any questions about any specific thing. So next we're going to look at something called masking. There's two different masks you can use in Photoshop. So let's say, you know, we just have a red layer, right? But we want to make sure that this, let's say this is a photograph and we don't want to edit it completely, but we want it to be, we want parts of it to be transparent, but without actually deleting those pixels. So when I say transparent, I mean like completely see-through, whereas opaque is completely solid. I don't know if you've heard those terms before. But, so what we're going to do to make that happen is down on the layers panel, you see this little guy? The white rectangle with the black circle? That's going to add a layers mask. And how this works is white means opaque and black means transparent. So, if I start drawing, you can see that we're seeing the white background underneath. But, as you can see, I'm still using black here. And then on the layers panel, on this layer mask, you can see that where I have drawn, it is black, and so you can see through it. This is super useful when you're doing something like with photo manipulation and you don't want to delete something in case you have to go back and use those pixels that you're erasing. So it's a lot less damaging. It's kind of one of those reversible methods that you can use if you're not entirely sold on something. And then our other type of mask is called a clipping mask. And how this works is it's only going to render on the pixels that are visible on the layer beneath it. So if we make a new layer, right click, and then hit create clipping mask, that's going to make a clipping mask. So if we're going to choose a darker red on this and just draw over it, and as you can see, it's only showing up on the red that's visible beneath it. So that's another thing that's super useful to use if like you have a color layer and you want to do shadows on it without actually editing the color layer itself in case you don't like how it turns out. You can make a clipping mask, and that makes it super easy to only affect that layer. The next thing I want to look at is filters. So there's a lot of filters that exist in Photoshop, and they can be kind of intimidating, but I just kind of want to introduce you to what they are, and I encourage you to go through and just kind of play with them and see which ones you like. So what I use quite often is, if we go into blur, Gaussian blur, you can just, you know, blur out the edges on something, which is really nice if you're doing like a glow effect or something along those lines. And then there's like motion blurs, things like that. So again under blur, motion blur. You know, stuff that would be a real pain to paint, suddenly you can make it work using filters. So that's something that I encourage you to go through and look at on your own, because there's a lot of very interesting ones that aren't necessarily that useful at all times, but sometimes they can be extremely situationally useful. So like this pixelate one, or mosaic, sorry, that can create some really interesting effects if you want to go for kind of like a retro pixelated look. All right, let's talk about brushes. So if you're in your brush tool right here, you can see the top toolbar, and these are going to be a lot of your settings for the brush. So right here we have all of the different brush presets. We're just going to stick with this hard round brush for now, just so I can kind of show off some of the other things. As you can see, I've got a lot of my own brushes, and I'll show you how to install those once I go through all of the brush settings. But these are the general brushes that you should have when booting up Photoshop. So, brush hardness, that kind of dictates what the edges of your brush looks like. So, as you can see here, it's a very hard edge, so there's no like blending in between the edge and the background. Whereas if I'm using the soft one, you can see that it's a lot more airbrushy. So you've got kind of these fuzzy edges, which is nice for blending, but that's just sort of the word for that is the hardness of the brush. So we can just turn that up if we want to, and suddenly it's a hard brush. I drew all of that on the background layer. Control backspace is a great way to fill in if you've done something like that. I'm going to make a new layer to draw on so you don't have to see me bumbling around like that. Okay, so next, this opens up your brush settings, which has a bunch of other different things. A lot of this is very complicated, but the most important one is this brush tip shape, which just sort of gives you all of this like spacing. Space out, you can make like a dotted line brush, or have it be completely solid. The hardness, like we just talked about. You can control the size here. I like to use the hotkeys of the 2 angle brackets. And this also has smoothing on, so we'll talk about that more in a little bit. The next button over here is the mode. So this is the same as the blending modes for your layers, if you remember me talking about that in the other tutorial. So let's choose screen to kind of demonstrate what that means. So as you can see, this draws like a normal brush, but now that there's something on this layer, if I go back over it, it's going to layer on top of it with that blending mode. So that's a fun way to use that if you don't want to make another layer and you just want to do something small on your current layer. And then we have our opacity slider, which it can go from completely transparent or almost completely transparent 1% to completely opaque. Transparent being completely see-through and opaque being completely solid. So that's 100% opacity, and that's 1%. And like 50 something. Oh, it's still on screen. That's why it's lightening up. See, that's an important thing to know. If your brush is acting weird, you might want to check your blending modes. And then the next is flow. Flow is kind of a weird one. It almost acts like opacity, but it is also dependent on if your brush has any texture built into it. So on a brush like this, where there's not a lot of texture, it's not super important. But as you can see on the edges of this brush, there's like a little bit of overlap. So if we up our flow all the way, that's going to disappear and it's going to be completely smooth. And if we knock it down to like that, you can see there's going to be more individual dots visible. And then smoothing is a very useful thing if you're doing, say, like line art or something. Let's bump this back up. If we bump it up to like, I usually go around 10%, but you can go a little bit more than that. And it's going to kind of lag your brush, but it's going to make your lines a lot smoother. So, like, say this is 0%, and then this is like 88. You can see how it doesn't quite keep up with my actual cursor. This is something that I recommend you mess around with and kind of get a feel for on your own, because it's hard to actually see, but it's really easy to feel when you're using it. This is kind of smoothing options. I wouldn't worry too much about it. You can mess around with those and see what you like. The angle of your brush isn't going to change anything when you have a circular brush, but again, if you have built-in textures, then it's going to change different things for that. Next, we have these little things up here. So what this means is these just lock the pressure sensitivity on your brush, right? So if I click this for opacity, if I go really lightly on my tablet, you can see it's a lot more transparent, whereas if I press hard, then it's completely opaque. Same for flow, it does the exact same thing. Here, I'll turn this off so you can see a little better. Again, that one's a little bit weird. Here, let's turn that down, maybe it'll be more pronounced. Yeah. An interesting thing to note, too, is with flow, you can get this sort of overlap with your strokes that you don't get with the opacity. And then this one right here does this for size. So lighter strokes means smaller brush size. And then this one right here, this is a fun little one. This is the symmetry draw tool. So you have a bunch of different types of symmetry you can use. Let's just do a vertical one real quick. So you can just sort of draw something that's symmetrical along this axis. Now this is something you might have to go in and enable. Let me know if you don't see it default in Photoshop, and I will tell you how to do that. I don't remember off the top of my head. I've had it enabled since I installed. But if you don't see it, don't worry, it's somewhere in the settings. So now let's talk about how to actually install brushes. So if you open up your brush panel here and go to your little settings and just do import brushes. So this is going to let you find brushes on your computer and install those. Okay, so if you want to find actual brushes to install, if we go to this setting box and then go to get more brushes, this is going to open up Photoshop's or Adobe's little landing page that has all these fun brushes. You will have to log in, which I believe you will have the access to if you're getting this free trial. And as you can see, there's a bunch of fun and different brushes that you can get. The manga brushes is probably a good place to start if you're looking for nice sketching brushes or something like that. But I'm going to just do the spatter brushes. So if you just hit download, then show in folder, I'm just going to move it to the desktop. Oh, where did they go? Whoops. I'm just going to move it to the desktop so that I can find it. And we go back to our Photoshop and just import brushes. Navigate to wherever we stored them, which is right here. And as you can see, they're going to appear in our brush panel. So now we have all of these fun ones that we can use to just sort of do all sorts of interesting things with. So here's where the magic of brushes really comes in, because you can find a bunch of different interesting brushes that you can use to kind of do stuff that would be a real pain to draw by hand. So like this cloud effect, as you can see, there's a lot of texture that goes into it that would be really hard to do with the default Photoshop brushes. I'm going to include a file with this video that goes over a bunch of different shortcuts that will help you navigate Photoshop more easily. I've already mentioned a couple of them, but just so we're clear, like a lot of other programs, Control S will let you save, Control Z is undo. You can hit B for the brush tool. While in the brush tool, Alt to select colors, X to change colors. Something that's really useful is if you use the square bracket keys to go and decrease or increase your brush size. Something that used to happen to me a lot when I was starting to learn Photoshop is I'd have a tiny little selection like that, and I wouldn't be able to figure out why I couldn't color anywhere else. So Control D is super useful because it prevents that sort of thing from happening. It just deselects whatever selection you currently have. All right, I think that's it for our quick introduction. I've included the list of useful Photoshop shortcuts, and I've also included a tutorial that's going to let you go through and actually put some of this into practice to create a couple different effects. I believe there's one that's going to be a little bit easier, and then one that's going to take a little bit more time. It'll be a little bit more complicated, but we'll kind of show you some other cool things. And then if neither of those really are vibing for you, I've included a list of other Photoshop tutorials that I found these on, and you can choose one of those, and that's going to be your homework for today. So good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.